The first time I read Harold Whitmore's will, I knew something was wrong. Not in the legal sense, the document was signed, dated, and witnessed properly, but in the way it felt. Words have a weight, and these didn't rest like ordinary clauses or property divisions. They sat there like riddles, deliberate, haunting, and strangely personal. I'd been an estate lawyer for 25 years, long enough to see grief wear 100 different masks. I'd seen families weep over heirlooms worth nothing and tear each other apart over land barely large enough to stand on. But Harold's will wasn't like any other. It wasn't a document meant to divide. It was meant to reveal. The morning I received it, the sky over Ravenswood was a colorless gray, the kind that presses down on you, making every breath feel heavier than the last. I remember the sound of my shoes against the old stone steps leading to my office, deliberate, echoing, almost ceremonial. I was expecting a routine file drop. Instead, the courier handed me a sealed leather case embossed with Harold's initials. Inside, one letter addressed to me and a will wrapped in ribbon the color of dried blood. The letter was brief. Elliot, when you read this, I will be gone. The will enclosed is not what it appears to be. Treat it with care and with conscience. The truth, as always, hides between the lines. H.W. I sat there for a long time, the paper trembling slightly between my fingers. Harold and I had known each other for years. He was my university lecturer before I ever became a lawyer. He had once told me, "The dead leave behind two things, what they own and what they regret." Back then, I thought it was philosophy. Now, sitting in my office, I wasn't so sure. 2 days later, I drove to the Whitmore estate, a sprawling colonial mansion at the edge of Ravenswood, surrounded by whispering pines and the faint hum of the nearby river. The Whitmore family had gathered for the will reading. I parked in the circular driveway beside an aging Rolls-Royce that looked more ceremonial than functional. Through the tall front windows, I could already see silhouettes, the family waiting, perhaps rehearsing their reactions for whatever fortune or disappointment awaited them. When I entered, Margaret Whitmore Kent greeted me first. "Mr. Granger," she said, her tone sharp but polite, as if cutting civility from obligation. "We've been waiting. Father's instructions said the will should be read by you personally." Her husband, Thomas Kent, stood a few steps behind her, all smiles and charm, the kind of man whose handshake lingered half a second too long, as though he were always performing sincerity. "Of course," I replied. "It's best if everyone is present. I'll need all direct heirs and relevant witnesses." They led me into the drawing room, a vast space lined with shelves of old books and a single portrait of Harold above the fireplace. His painted eyes seemed to follow every movement in the room. Daniel Whitmore, the youngest son, was already there. He looked out of place, wearing a worn jacket, no tie, his hair a little unkempt. He stood near the window, staring out into the gray landscape like he was somewhere else entirely. Beside him sat Eleanor Price, Harold's longtime caretaker. She rose when I entered, offering a small nod. "Mr. Granger," she said softly, "Harold spoke very highly of you. He trusted you." I returned the nod, grateful for her steadiness. I only hope I can honor that trust. When everyone had gathered, I placed the sealed leather case on the table. The air shifted immediately, the kind of collective inhale that comes before something irreversible. I untied the ribbon, unfolded the parchment, and began. This is the last will and testament of Harold Benjamin Whitmore, dated March 14th, 2022. The first sections were ordinary enough, formal declarations, executor assignments, and modest charitable donations. But then, as the clauses progressed, something in the tone changed. "To my eldest daughter, Margaret, I leave the mirror in the east hallway, so she might see herself clearly, as I once failed to do." Margaret's brow furrowed. "The mirror," she repeated, almost offended. "To my son-in-law, Thomas Kent, I leave my collection of first-edition books, that he may one day learn to value words over wealth." A subtle laugh escaped Daniel's lips, quickly suppressed. Thomas's smile tightened. "Is this some kind of joke?" "To my youngest son, Daniel, I leave the key to my study. What you choose to unlock with it will determine what you truly inherit." The room fell silent. I paused, reading over the next line again to be sure I hadn't misinterpreted it. And to those who stand before this reading, know this. What I have written here is not what it seems. The truth of my estate lies where the law cannot reach. Seek the heart, not the hand, and you will find me. I looked up slowly. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint crackle of the fire. Margaret's face had turned pale. "What does that mean?" she demanded. "Where are the assets, the accounts, the deeds? This sounds like riddles." I turned to her gently. "Mrs. Kent, this document has all the legal hallmarks of a will, but I believe Mr. Whitmore intended something else as well." Daniel stepped forward, eyes narrowing. "A message," he said quietly. "This isn't about money." Thomas scoffed. "Oh, please, the man was senile. Everyone knows he'd lost track of his affairs these last few years." Eleanor's voice cut through the tension. "Harold lost many things, Mr. Kent," she said evenly, "but not his clarity. He knew exactly what he was doing." I closed the file gently and exhaled. The document is legally binding only to the extent that it transfers symbolic possessions. There's no mention of the estate itself or any financial assets. Margaret slammed her hand against the table. "Then where is the real will?" Eleanor hesitated before speaking. "Perhaps there isn't one." All eyes turned to her. She looked down at her clasped hands, then up again, meeting my gaze. "Harold told me, weeks before he died, that he was tired of watching his family fight over things that could never bring them peace. He said, the will wasn't meant for lawyers or judges, it was meant for them." She gestured softly toward the family. He said, "Let them earn what they value most, truth or forgiveness." For a long moment, no one moved. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. The fire hissed softly, throwing long, shifting shadows across the room. I looked down at the parchment again, at the cryptic language, the almost poetic phrasing. Harold had left clues, not instructions. Each symbolic bequest hinted at a deeper meaning. The mirror, the books, the key, each connected to a truth buried beneath years of resentment. And somehow, I realized, I had been drawn into his design. This was never about distributing wealth. It was about exposing the truth he'd left behind. As the family dispersed, Margaret fuming, Thomas muttering curses, Daniel lost in thought, I stayed behind with Eleanor. She approached quietly. "There's something else," she said, lowering her voice. "He gave me something before he died, told me to hand it to you only after the reading." From her coat pocket she drew out a small wooden box, no larger than a diary, sealed with a brass clasp. My initials were carved faintly into its underside. I froze. "He left this for me?" She nodded. "He said it would guide you to understand what he truly intended." I turned the box over in my hands. The brass was cool to the touch, the wood smooth but worn. It didn't open, not yet. There was no visible keyhole, only a carved inscription along the lid. "Truth is not inherited. It is uncovered." Eleanor watched me carefully. "He trusted you, Mr. Granger. He believed you'd know what to do when the time came." I looked back toward the empty room, the lingering tension in the air, the faint echo of Harold's portrait watching from above. Whatever this was, it wasn't finished. The real inheritance hadn't even begun. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about that wooden box. It sat on my desk, untouched, the carved words glinting faintly in the morning light. Truth is not inherited. It is uncovered. Harold's message lingered in my mind like a whisper I couldn't quite decipher. I'd spent years dealing with wills that spoke of ownership. This was the first one that spoke of truth. I tried every legal trick I knew, examined the box under lamplight, tested its edges, even held it against my ear like some forgotten relic. No hinges, no seams, no keyhole, just a single faint groove running along one edge, almost invisible, except under a slant of sunlight. It wasn't a container, it was a puzzle, and Harold Whitmore had always loved puzzles. At noon, the Whitmore family returned to my office. Margaret led the way, her posture sharp enough to cut glass. Thomas trailed behind, expression hard, while Daniel lingered near the doorway, cautious, quiet, observant. "Mr. Granger," Margaret began curtly, "we've reviewed the so-called will and have decided it must be invalid. Father's mental state was clearly compromised. We'll be petitioning for the court to recognize the prior testament from 2 years ago. I folded my hands. You're within your rights to file, Mrs. Kent. But before you do, I must remind you, this document carries his final notarized signature. It's legally binding, even if it feels unconventional. Thomas smirked. Binding? Please. He left riddles and trinkets. This isn't a will. It's a game. Daniel spoke quietly. Maybe that's the point. All eyes turned toward him. He continued, voice steady but distant. My father used to say that people show their true selves when faced with something they can't control. Maybe this was his way of showing us who we've become. Margaret scoffed. Don't romanticize his nonsense, Daniel. Father was a brilliant man, not a playwright. He didn't leave us poetry. He left us property, and it's our right to claim it. I interjected gently. He also left conditions, Mrs. Kent. The symbolic items may not seem like much, but they could represent directives. I'd advise you to investigate before dismissing them entirely. Her eyes narrowed. Are you suggesting there's another document? I'm suggesting, I said carefully, that there's something he intended you to find. That evening, long after they left, I opened Harold's file again. I reread every clause, every comma. The document wasn't cryptic for the sake of theatrics, it was coded. The phrases, mirror in the east hallway, key to my study, and the heart, not the hand, all pointed somewhere. The question was, where? I returned to the estate the next day. The caretaker, Eleanor, met me at the door. I thought you might come, she said softly. He told me you would. Did he leave anything else for me? Only this. From her apron pocket she withdrew an envelope, yellowed and folded once. My name was written across it in Harold's unmistakable handwriting. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single line. Begin where it ends. And beneath that, a set of coordinates, numbers I recognized instantly. They marked the Whitmore family cemetery. The Whitmore graveyard sat behind the estate, hidden by tall yew trees that had stood for centuries. The path was overgrown, the air still and heavy with damp moss. As I walked through the narrow gate, the world seemed to quiet. The distant sounds of the town faded until all I could hear was the crunch of gravel beneath my shoes and the slow rhythm of my breath. Harold's headstone was simple. Beloved father, scholar, and seeker of truth. I traced the inscription with my fingers. For a man of such wealth, his grave was modest. No statues, no marble, just stone and silence. I crouched down and noticed something unusual. A small metal plate embedded near the base of the headstone, engraved with a barely visible insignia, the same crest carved into the wooden box. I pressed it lightly. A faint click sounded, followed by a soft mechanical whir. The ground beneath the stone shifted slightly, not enough to lift, but enough to expose a hollow compartment, small and deliberate. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, lay a folded sheet of paper. My pulse quickened. It was a second document, handwritten, dated 1 week before Harold's death. To whoever seeks this. If you are reading these words, you have begun to see what others refuse to. This is not my will, but my confession. Years ago, a wrong was done, not by strangers, but by blood. I sought to correct it quietly, but found no peace in silence. The truth lies within the study, beneath the portrait of my late wife. There you will find what truly belongs to this family. H.W. I stood frozen, the wind stirring faintly around me. A confession, a hidden truth. It wasn't about inheritance at all. It was about redemption. That night, I returned to the mansion. The hallways were dark, save for a few dim sconces casting long shadows along the walls. Eleanor met me at the threshold of the study, her hands trembling slightly. I knew there was something, she whispered. He spent so many nights in here before he died, said he was setting things right. The study smelled of old paper and pipe smoke, the ghost of Harold's presence lingering in the air. The portrait of his late wife, Clara, hung above the fireplace, serene, her painted eyes holding a tenderness that made the room feel smaller. I approached slowly, heart pounding. Beneath the frame, faint scratches marked the wood, signs of use, not neglect. I pressed gently on the lower right corner. The painting shifted forward, revealing a recessed compartment in the wall. Inside was a sealed envelope and a small brass key. The envelope read, "To my children, if ever they learn to listen." Inside were several sheets of paper, financial ledgers, letters, and one startling revelation: a forged contract transferring large portions of the family fortune from Daniel to Thomas Kent, signed years earlier but clearly falsified. Harold had discovered it. He had evidence. And this will was never about distribution. It was his way of ensuring that the truth would eventually surface, even if too late to confront in life. I sat there in stunned silence, staring at the documents. The pattern made sense now. The riddles, the cryptic phrasing, the moral symbolism. Harold hadn't trusted anyone in his family to carry out justice, so he'd written a document disguised as a will, one that only someone who cared enough to read between the lines could understand. "Mr. Granger," Eleanor's voice broke the silence. "What will you do with it?" I turned to her. What he intended me to do. She nodded, eyes glistening. He believed truth was the only thing worth leaving behind. The next morning, I called the family back to the estate. Margaret arrived first, visibly irritated. Thomas followed, cautious but curious. Daniel trailed last, a hint of apprehension in his step. "I've discovered an additional document," I said calmly, placing the envelope on the desk. "One that changes everything." Margaret frowned. "Another one? What now? Poetry?" I opened the envelope and spread the contents across the table. The letters, the ledgers, the signatures, all of it in Harold's unmistakable handwriting. Daniel leaned forward, eyes scanning the documents. These show transfers that shouldn't exist. "Thomas, this is—" "Don't," Thomas snapped, his voice cracked, trembling. "You don't know what you're talking about." Margaret turned to her husband. "Thomas, what is this?" But his silence said everything. I laid the final letter on the table, the one addressed to my children. "The wealth you fought over was never truly yours. It was built on deceit. What I leave behind is not fortune, but freedom, if you can face what you've become." Margaret sank into her chair, pale as parchment. Daniel closed his eyes, tears welling at the corners. Thomas rose abruptly, the pretense of confidence gone. "You think this changes anything? He's dead. You can't prove what he wrote." "Maybe not in court," I said, "but his confession, combined with the evidence, paints a truth that will never fade, not in this town, not in memory." For a long moment, no one spoke. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its warmth at odds with the cold weight of the revelation. Then Daniel whispered, "He wasn't trying to punish us. He was trying to save us." As they left the room one by one, I remained behind, the brass key still in my hand. The study felt different now, quieter, lighter, as though Harold's presence had finally lifted. I turned to the wooden box on my desk. On a sudden impulse, I ran my finger along the carved words again. "Truth is not inherited. It is uncovered." The faint groove I'd noticed earlier caught my thumb, and this time, it clicked. The lid slid open with a soft whisper. Inside was a single folded note. "Well done, Elliot. You have seen them as I did, and you chose truth. Keep the box. You too are part of the inheritance." I smiled faintly, tears pricking my eyes. Harold had left his greatest gift not to his family, but to the one man who could carry his truth forward without distortion. And as I closed the box and placed it gently on the shelf, I realized some wills don't divide legacies, they reveal them. The Whitmore estate stood quiet again, but the silence was different now, strained, uneasy, as if the very walls were holding their breath. The truth had been set free, but truth, I was learning, rarely left anyone untouched. I'd seen it before, in dozens of families torn apart by money, pride, or guilt, but never like this. Never with such precision. Harold Whitmore hadn't written a will. He'd orchestrated a confession, one meant to detonate only when his children could no longer pretend. And now that it had gone off, the echoes were everywhere. 3 days later, the family summoned me again. The tone was different this time, not defiant, not demanding, more hollow. Margaret entered first, pale and composed, but her confidence had cracks. Thomas wasn't beside her anymore. She came alone. Daniel followed soon after, his face gaunt, his voice quieter than ever. "I assume," Margaret began, "that you've already filed the new evidence with the probate court." I nodded. "Yes, it's been submitted as a supplemental testament, not a replacement. The law will still honor the first document's terms, but the second will override any property transfers that were based on fraud." She exhaled slowly. "Then the estate will be split evenly again?" "Yes," I said, "as your father originally intended before the forged addendum." She glanced toward Daniel, who looked away. "Then there's nothing left to fight over." There was an emptiness in her tone, the kind that comes only when the reason for fighting vanishes, and all that's left is the silence afterward. After they left, I stayed behind to finalize the paperwork. The wind outside had picked up, whispering against the old glass panes. Eleanor, the caretaker, appeared in the doorway holding a tray of tea. "They're gone?" "For now." She poured 2 cups, her movements careful and slow. "I don't think they'll be back soon. The house feels lighter already." I looked up. "Did you know about the forgery?" Her eyes flickered with something between guilt and grief. "Not at first. But I saw Mr. Thomas come into the study one night, years ago, carrying documents. He left before dawn, and afterward your client, Mr. Whitmore, was never quite the same. He stopped eating, stopped speaking much." "And he never confronted them?" She shook her head. "He said forgiveness without truth is just cowardice. He didn't want to destroy his children while he was alive, so he built his confession instead." I took a slow sip of tea. "He used me to finish it." "No," she said softly. "He trusted you to." Later that night, I found myself wandering the halls of the empty estate. Every step echoed, every portrait watched. The mansion had once been a monument to wealth, but now it felt like an archive of regrets. I paused before Clara Whitmore's portrait, the one that had concealed the hidden compartment. Her eyes, painted decades ago, seemed almost alive in the flickering lamplight. There was a faint draft coming from the wall behind the fireplace. I knelt down and examined it. An air vent, old and rusted. Something glimmered faintly inside. Using the brass key Harold had left, I pried it open. Inside was a small tin box, tarnished with age. I hesitated before lifting the lid. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, and letters written in Clara's delicate handwriting. They weren't love letters. They were pleas. "Harold, you must tell them the truth. It isn't Daniel's fault. If we hide it, we'll lose more than our fortune. We'll lose them. Please, my love, don't let guilt become their inheritance." The letters were dated 30 years ago, and suddenly everything clicked. This wasn't about stolen money. It was about something deeper, something that had been buried long before any will existed. I searched through the box again until I found a sealed envelope addressed to "My son." Not sons, singular. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in Harold's firm, unmistakable hand. "Daniel, there is no easy way to tell you this. You were not born of deceit, but of love, a love I could not acknowledge while your mother lived. You are not my blood, but you are my son." Thomas forged his claim to protect what he believed was rightfully his, not realizing that you were the only one who ever truly deserved it. I failed both of you in silence. This is my attempt to make amends, however late. H.W. I felt the air leave my chest. Daniel wasn't Harold's biological son. He was Clara's child from another man, a secret Harold had buried under the weight of propriety and reputation. The forged contract wasn't greed alone. It was panic, fear of exposure. The will wasn't just a message. It was Harold's final attempt to tell Daniel the truth of who he was and who he wasn't. The next morning, I called Daniel back to the estate. He arrived alone, a quiet tension in his expression. "You said you found something else?" I hesitated before handing him the envelope. "Your father wanted you to have this. Read it privately if you wish." He took it, hands trembling slightly, eyes scanning the handwriting he'd known since childhood. Silence stretched between us as he read. When he reached the end, he didn't speak. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came. Then, softly, "He knew." "Yes," I said. "And he forgave long before he wrote this." Tears welled in his eyes, but his voice stayed steady. "All these years, I thought he kept me at a distance because he didn't love me. But it wasn't that, was it? It was guilt." I nodded. "He loved you, maybe more than anyone. He just didn't know how to show it. He sank into the armchair, the letter trembling in his hands. And Thomas, he hated me for something I didn't even know. Harold hoped this would set him free too, I said gently. But some truths come too late for reconciliation. Later that day, the Whitmores gathered one final time at Harold's grave. The autumn wind carried the scent of cedar and soil. The family stood apart, three figures framed by the fading light, Margaret on one side, Thomas on the other, Daniel standing between them, not as an heir, but as a man finally at peace. No one spoke at first. Then Daniel stepped forward, placing the folded letter at the base of the stone. "I forgive you," he whispered. Thomas turned sharply. "For what?" "For everything you thought I took from you." Thomas stared at him, then at the grave, and for the first time, his anger faltered. His jaw trembled and his voice broke. "He was supposed to love me like that." Daniel met his gaze. "He did. Just differently." The two men stood there for a long time, the silence between them neither hostile nor forgiving, just human. Margaret, for once, said nothing. She only reached into her coat pocket and placed a single white rose on the grave. "Father," she said quietly, "you got your truth." And with that, the Whitmores walked away. Weeks later, I closed the Whitmore case. The estate was divided fairly, the debts settled, the hidden documents archived. But the wooden box remained with me. Harold's final gift. One evening, I opened it again. The note still sat inside, along with a small folded newspaper clipping I hadn't noticed before. It was an article from 30 years ago. Local teacher missing, presumed dead. The name beneath it matched the one from Clara's letters. I realized then that Harold had lived his entire life protecting a secret that had already turned to dust. All his riddles, his cryptic wording, his strange final will, they weren't just messages to his children, they were a monument to regret. Yet, in a strange way, he'd succeeded. He had forced his family, for the first time, to face the truth together. Months passed. I visited the Whitmore estate one last time before it went on the market. Eleanor greeted me with a faint smile. "Feels emptier without him, doesn't it?" "It does." We walked through the grand hall, now stripped of portraits and furniture. The echo of our footsteps filled the space where arguments once had. At the door, she paused. "Do you ever think he meant for you to find more than just the truth?" I smiled faintly. "I think he meant for me to remember it." She nodded, then handed me something, a small brass plaque she'd removed from his study desk. It read, "Inheritance is not possession, it is understanding." I ran my thumb over the engraving, then slipped it into my coat pocket. Outside, the sun was setting behind the hills, casting the estate in gold. For the first time, I didn't see the house as a monument to greed or sorrow. I saw it as Harold had, a place where truth had finally been spoken, even if it had taken death to free it. As I drove away, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. The mansion's silhouette stood against the burning sky like an ancient witness, solemn and eternal. And I realized something. Some wills give away money, some divide families. But the rarest kind, the kind Harold Whitmore left behind, doesn't end with signatures or inheritance. It ends with understanding. And sometimes, that's the only legacy that matters.
Thank you for watching this story until the end. If you found it meaningful, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Your support helps us continue bringing powerful, real stories from around the world.